Today we are going to finish our study, at least temporarily, our study in the book of Genesis. We're going to move on for a little while anyways and look at the life of Christ. But we are going to finish up this first section of the book of Genesis. And I want to give you a way to remember what we have studied so far. It's amazing. We've been looking at the first 11 chapters, and it's taken us 15 weeks to do it. That's my fault. But I do have some hand motions for you, so I need everybody to participate, okay? You're going to learn 4 hand motions that are going to help you remember the big picture of these early chapters in the book of Genesis, all right? So start like this, put your hands like this. Okay, we're going to make a world because we're going to remember that God created everything. We're going to say creation. All right, let's try that one more time. Creation. And then what happened after creation? Everything was good. It was very good. Adam and Eve sinned, and we have the fall. Some of you have done this before, if you've ever done a walk through the Bible thing. So we have creation, we have fall, and then what happened next? What was the next big thing that happened? The flood. The flood. And today we're going to talk about the nations and how the nations were spread out throughout the whole earth. But reading Genesis chapter 10, that's one of those throwaway chapters for us sometimes. All these names we can't pronounce. But if your name is in a long list of names, you pay attention. It's like looking through someone's family album. If you're not in it, if you don't know anybody in it, you're like, whatever, who are these people? But if you're in it, and if it's your relatives. I may have told this story before about 1.5 years ago, but when I was a little boy, my great-grandmother White gave me a list of names that started with Israel Putnam, Revolutionary War hero. Supposedly, he's the guy that said, don't fire till you see. See, you guys know about him. You probably didn't know his name. And she had a direct line. It wasn't a family tree. It was like a family pole that went from Israel Putnam all the way down to me. And I lost that piece of paper. I lost it. But you know, when we read the names in the Bible, don't forget that every one of those names was a person with hopes and with dreams and with difficulties and joys and marriage and family and all of that stuff. And when we read people's names, we might not even be able to pronounce it. It might not mean anything to us. It meant something to the first readers of the book of Genesis. But I want to remind you that your name is also in a book. It'd be kind of cool to have your name in the book. But there is a book of life that everyone who has put their hope and their trust in Jesus, your name is in that book. And so never forget that. And so as we look at this genealogy, it seems Moses likes to kind of tie up loose ends. He did that with the genealogical line of Cain. He's going to do that now with Japheth and Ham, but he's really getting to the main course, which is the line of Shem, which is eventually going to lead after generation to the promised Messiah, the seed of the woman that was promised in Genesis chapter 3. And so what we have here in Genesis 11 is almost like bookends with Genesis chapter 3. And then we're going to move on. Eventually, we'll come back after we study the life of Christ for a while, but eventually we will move on and we will come to the promise, the covenant that God would make with Abraham. I want to read to you just a little kind of preview, if you will, of the first couple of verses of Genesis chapter 12. And I want you to notice a word that sticks out over and over. We talked about this word last week. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. We have a God who loves to bless. But remember, we ended last week with this. God loves to bring us in and bless us, but he doesn't want us to stay there. He then sends us out. God is in the business of making a missionary people. He's going to do that with Abraham, who will become a large family, the 12 tribes of Israel, and they will become a nation that was put on this earth for the very specific reason of lifting up the name of God, of drawing all people to the God who is, and being a missionary in a world where people are pagans, where they are worshiping false gods, where they are elevating their own name, trying to make a name for themselves. And while chapter 10 might feel to us a little bit like a throwaway section, a bunch of names that we can't pronounce, one scholar named William F. Albright says this. He says the 10th chapter of Genesis stands absolutely alone in ancient literature. No other ancient culture has something that is even remotely close to this. He says, without a remote parallel, even among the Greeks, where we find the closest approach to a distribution of peoples in genealogical framework. The Table of Nations, as this is often called, remains an astounding, accurate document. Now, we'll find that there's about 70 names listed in Genesis chapter 10 that represent all of the nations that exist on earth today. All of the different languages came from this genealogical record. We have, first of all, the descendants of Japheth. And I'll throw up a map here for you to kind of look at the big picture of where the descendants of these three sons of Noah kind of made their way. You can see that the descendants of Japheth, as they would extend, it's interesting, God had a promise for Japheth in the previous chapter. It says this, may God extend Japheth's territory. And they would spread out over all of what is now Europe, Eastern Europe, India, the Slavic nations, including Russia, the Greek and Cretan people groups, as well as those who would migrate. They would cross over that strait that goes from Russia to Alaska. I can't remember what the name of that is. Come down into North America and even into South America. And so all of these people groups come from the descendants of Japheth. And then you have the descendants of Ham that would include different Asian groups, African groups, some in the Middle East, Arab groups, and some of the Eastern people groups. And then you have the descendants of Shem. And these are the descendants where Abraham and the Hebrew people would come from. But you also have Persians, Syrians, and Babylonians that would all descend from Shem. And now as these people spread out over the years, and you can read it in chapter 10. It talks about how they spread out in different areas of the world. They brought with them certain strengths and weaknesses. They also brought with them different languages that we will learn about today. And what I want to say, first of all, here, as they spread out throughout the earth, they're in a sense fulfilling God's command, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. They're doing exactly what God wanted them to. But I want to hit on something because there's been a belief, it's kind of died out, it's not around so much now, but the differences that developed in these people groups as they spread out, we need to remember that the skin color is just the outward differences. Science tells us that that is about the only difference between all the different people groups in the world. It's merely skin deep. What's interesting is that there was a linguist, and he was part of the Genome Project. And when he's not even a believer, he was an atheist, but he was part of the team that was working on the Genome Project. And what he discovered after they put together all the genes in for the human was that this is what he said, there is only one race, the human race. Now, the reality is that while there are different skin tones, stemming from very light to very dark, if you looked at it like a bell curve, most people are in the middle, and that is the reality that we have today. Most people in this world today are somewhere in between dark and light, and we call them brown. And so the truth is we're all different shades of brown. And yet, what's happening today in our world is almost a reversal of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in his great line when he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Critical race theory, which is making its way into our culture, into our schools, is really trying to force everyone into a racial category. And as Christians, when we understand the Bible, that there's only one human race, yet different shades of brown, we must stand against this evil. And where we separate ourselves and divide ourselves based on skin color. Now, there are other differences that developed over time, body type, brain type, eye color, eye shape. There's all kinds of different characteristics that developed as people immigrated throughout the whole world. And that's kind of the way genetics work, right? You have dominant genes and recessive genes, and you put everybody in a gene pool, and you kind of stay in that enclosed gene pool, and certain characteristics become dominant over time. Darwinian evolution, in my opinion, has done tremendous damage in our world by arguing that each race, which he identifies by skin color, were at different stages of evolution. In fact, at one point, he said that Aboriginals and African people were closer to apes than to humans. Evolution would actually lead to some of the worst forms of racism in world history. In his second book, Darwin said this. It's called The Descent of Man. He said in his second book, it is filled with incredibly racist statements, and he talks about how civilized people groups, which were mostly Europeans at the time, would eventually wipe out the uncivilized people groups. This was all part of his Darwinian evolutionary belief system. And then later on, a gal named Margaret Sanger, and I've talked about her before. She's the one who founded Planned Parenthood, and her form of eugenics, which was based out of Darwinian evolution, intended not only to keep darker-skinned people, but lower IQ, lighter-skinned people from reproducing. But from what we know genetically, and I'm not a geneticist, this is like kindergarten level genetics, but what we do know about genetics is that what we should be saying is not what shade of color are you, or not what race you are from, but what people group you are from. And so while evolution is not exactly observable, it's a theory. What we can observe is natural selection, adaptation. This is the way genetics works. Skin color is just one difference between the different people groups. But you also have, as I said, head shape, eye color, nose, hair, body size. In fact, you've heard about the shortest people group on earth, the pygmies. Their average height is 4'4". How many of you would love to be around them? You just feel like, man, I'm a giant. And then you have the Sudanese people not too far from the pygmy people, and their average height is 6'4". Average. Here's a picture of one of the most famous Sudanese, Manute Bol, and Spud Webb, one of my favorite players. But you add to that, now you got to think here for a sec. This is going to feel a little bit more like a seminary class today than a sermon. But you add to that diet, weather conditions, access to trade routes, shipping ports, intermingling with other people groups and other cultures, which often brings progress. You learn from that culture, they learn from you. You steal their ideas, they steal yours. And that's how some cultures began to advance. The weather had a huge impact. Whether you had a port near where you lived had a huge impact on the advancement of technology and culture. And you put all that together, and what you have is an incredibly diverse human race. And yet, still just one race. And it all came from Noah and his 3 sons, who, by the way, when you think about it, had all the genetic diversity It was already there in Noah's genes. And this is why, by the way, just to kind of go back a little bit to the ark, this is why 2 of every kind of animal was put on the ark. Not 2 of every species, but 2 of every kind. Let me give you an example. In fact, there would have been plenty of room on the ark. But we have a lot of dog lovers in this church. I think you're crazy, but that's okay. I'm just kidding. By the way, we do allow a couple of dogs here. I want to say this publicly. These are service dogs for specifically people that have PTSD, our veterans. And so we allow them. This is not to encourage everybody to bring your lap dog. But back to dogs, it is interesting that the tiny Chihuahua and the giant Great Dane are almost identical on a genetic level. Here's a Great Dane snuggling up with a puppy Chihuahua. But you add to that, and you think about it, the wolf, the coyote, the jackal, the dingo, these are all under the class or the kind of canine. And the way genetics works, when you breed certain dogs for certain characteristics, in fact, humans over the last 150 years have created some dog breeds that did not exist before, and I don't think they were supposed to exist, but mankind got involved. And what we see in these dogs and animals is that they're great pets, but they also probably cost you thousands of dollars because they tend to have lots of problems being stuck in a very small gene pool. Get a mutt. Those are the ones that you don't have to spend a dime on. But I will say this. There's 2 interesting things that come out as you read through Genesis chapter 10. We're done with our genetics lesson. And the first one is, towards the end of the chapter, there's a guy named Peleg. And if you're an stout student, what you're going to realize is that Peleg is also mentioned in the genealogy in chapter 11. But what it says is during the life of Peleg, it says 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because in his time the earth was divided. So Moses is giving us an account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah, but then he's going to go back in chapter 11 and tell us how that division took place. But the second person that is mentioned in the genealogical record is a guy named Nimrod. Love that name. Great name for a dog, by the way. Don't name your kid Nimrod. Let me read to you what it says about Nimrod, because I think the author here has given us a heads up as to part of why what happened in chapter 11 was necessary. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is not a saying that exists today. It was 4,000 years ago. The first centers of his kingdom, first time kingdom is mentioned, by the way, in the Bible, were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh, Shinar. And from that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Kala, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Kala, which is the great city. Now, Nimrod, it appears, is the first world leader who wants to bring people together. One of the misfortunes of translations from Hebrew to English is that this idea of Nimrod being a mighty hunter before the Lord, it's a little bit misleading. What it ought to probably say is that Nimrod was a mighty, enslaving hunter of people. He probably hunted animals, but it appears that historically and based on commentaries that go back a couple thousand years, is that the belief was that Nimrod was one of those Hitler-type world leaders. Think of Alexander the Great or the great King Nebuchadnezzar. Every other world leader in history who tried to conquer the world under one political power and world system. Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, And you could probably throw in some other people inspired by Nimrod who are alive today. But most people today think of Nimrod as an idiot or fool. Do you know where that came from? Looney Tunes. I think it was back in the 50s, Bugs Bunny would call Elmer Fudd, who was a hunter, Nimrod. And so the whole meaning of Nimrod was changed because of Bugs Bunny. But Nimrod was, and you look at those lists of kingdoms that he built, those cities that he built. Some of them are familiar to us. Nineveh, for example, they were a people, the very cruel, very evil people, hated the Jewish people, and the Jewish people returned that. Some of you know the story of Jonah. But he was behind many of these great cities in the ancient world. The greatest at the time being Calah. Nobody had ever heard of Calah. Critics argued for many years that the Bible was wrong. No such city existed until 1845. Sir Austin Henry Layard discovered the ruins of the city, proving that it did exist. And some of the records that they uncovered showed that the city was very wicked and rebellious, and that it was wiped out completely at some point in history. Not only from the face of the earth, but apparently from man's memory as well. But interestingly, as he uncovered what was once Calah, the local people in that area, you know what they called it? Nimrod. Isn't that interesting? And so most scholars think Nimrod was the leader who united the people of the world at this time and was behind the building of the Tower of Babel, which we will hit in just a minute. But it is a bit misleading to describe Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord, as I said. Yes, he was a hunter of animals, but primarily a hunter of people. He subjugated people under him as slaves. He tried to reverse God's will on the planet, and he probably became a sort of Satan worshiper through worship of false gods. And some scholars think that at this time, worship of the stars, the zodiac, astrology, witchcraft, all kind of came into play at this time. Now, here's what's really interesting to me. This is all taking place only about 100 years after the flood. Think about that. 8 people survived the flood. God's judgment on sin and wickedness and evil was why the flood came in the first place, and it only took about 100 years for mankind to descend into that kind of violence and depravity once again. And if you pay attention, if you take them at face value, the dates of how long these people lived, Noah was still alive when Nimrod led the people of the world to build a city and to build a tower and to make a name for themselves. Let's read about the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and a common speech. One language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, and by the way, the idea of the east is often used as a euphemism to describe people moving away from God. And they found a plain in Shinar and settled there, which is, by the way, really close to where the Garden of Eden was. There is a belief among many scholars that this was an attempt by Nimrod and the people at this time to get back to the Garden of Eden, to create their own paradise. Nothing wrong per se with that, but it's how they go about it and their motives behind it. But they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves." And therein lies what's wrong with this entire story. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth, which is, by the way, what God wanted them to do. He wanted them to scatter throughout the whole earth and to take care of nature. But the Lord came down. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. Now, we've got to be careful here because whenever we describe God, The authors often use human terms to describe a God who is above all of creation. Did God actually come down? Perhaps. He's done that before. Did he need to come down to see what was going on? There's a little bit of irony, I think, going on here. Here these people are trying to build this tower up to the heavens, to God. Not so much, scholars tell us now, so that they can get to God, but more so that God can come to them. And the irony is that you can build a tower as high as you can. God still has to come down even to see it. Even to see it. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower of the people that they were building. And the Lord said, if as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down. Play on words there. Come, let us build. God says, come, let us go down. And confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. And so the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. One language, one speech. Now, we could really geek out on this. I'm going to spare you guys. But we could really go down some rabbit holes on this whole idea of language and linguistics. But did you know, for example, that English and Hindi both come, very different languages, and Russian, by the way, all three of these languages, they have discovered, come from one common source. It's a language that has long been lost. Nobody knows exactly how to speak it. In fact, there's no writing of it, but linguists tell us that this all came from one language. But the question is why scatter the people? Why confuse their language? What's really going on here? And what we see is what we've seen in the past in the book of Genesis. Two parallel things going on as the human race begins to grow and expand throughout the earth. First of all, you see incredible, creative, clever ingenuity and technology of the human race. Why is that? Because we're made in the image of God. We've been reminded of that and told that over and over in the chapters so far. We are made in the image of God. And because we bear the image of God, there's a divine spark in us. And we have this incredible ability to be creative and entrepreneurs and ingenious. And we can do amazing things because we're made in the image of God. But at the very same time, right alongside that is you see the incredible depravity and sinfulness of mankind. And so while mankind has incredible ability to create and innovate, it also has incredible ability to be evil and to do harm. And so what we have here is God stepping in judgment, but also in mercy. We have, think about it, the invention so far in the book of Genesis, we have the invention of arts, music, iron technology, weaponry, shipbuilding, city building, agriculture, vineyards, the domestication of certain animals. But we also have what we talked about a few weeks ago, the way of Cain. The way of Cain is attempting to connect with or relate with God, but on your terms, not on his terms. The way of Cain is making a great name for yourself instead of lifting up the name of God. And so what we have is we have murder, we have enslavement, we have violence, we have rebellion against God, polygamy, and patriarchy, and all kinds of other evil things going right along with the advancement of technology of mankind. But notice the language that is used here. Let us make a name for ourselves. See, the reason the Tower of Babel was such a bad idea is because it was all about mankind. doing things for themselves instead of for the glory of God. And by the way, we do this individually as well. We do this in a micro sense, whereas at this time it was in a macro sense, to the point where God would intervene and stop what they were doing. The first century Jews believed that Nimrod was motivated by Satan to usurp the place of God in leading the rebellion against God to make a name for themselves without God. I would say this: they wanted God, but they wanted God in their hip pocket. They wanted God to be on their side. They wanted God's blessings, but they didn't want God. They wanted God to defend them and protect them and give them a sense of identity and give them a sense of security, but they really didn't want God. They all wanted to go about it in their own way. But God steps in, and as I said, he steps in an act of judgment, but at the same time in an act of mercy, to ultimately restrain how evil people could become. Imagine if Hitler had won. Imagine if Stalin had won. Imagine if Putin or Xi. Imagine evil unrestrained in this world. By the way, this is a major theme in the Old Testament, this idea of judgment and mercy. And along with judgment and mercy, we see mankind never getting better, never improving. And so God is always kind of stepping in with judgment and mercy. It's judgment because they were doing it for themselves. It's mercy because God was holding back, restraining how evil they could really become and how much destruction they could ultimately do and accomplish in this world. And what they do is they build a city. Nothing wrong with cities per se. Some of you live up here in the mountains because you don't want to live in the city, because cities tend to attract not just good things, but also bad things. And so they build a tower. Now, these towers were known as ziggurats, and they've uncovered about 30 of these ziggurats in the Mesopotamian area, modern-day Iraq. And they were very important. Every significant city had this ziggurat because it was part of their temple worship, is a way for them to kind of build a tower, initially thought so people could reach up to God, but I think it was more likely they were creating a way for God to come down to them. Again, so that they could kind of have God in their hip pocket and God on their team, and God would protect them and defeat their enemies and foes and such. On one site of Babel, and you know the story, God would interrupt it, he would change their languages, and they all kind of float around, try to find somebody that spoke the same language as them, and they would form these people groups and eventually spread out throughout the whole earth. But what's interesting is that same spot, they've uncovered where this tower may have been in modern-day Iraq, but eventually another city would be built on top of it, and it would become perhaps the greatest world power this world has ever known, and that was the kingdom of Babylon. It would borrow that same name. And in Daniel chapter 4, you read about King Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon. They're the ones that eventually went in and enslaved the Jewish people, destroyed the temple about 500 years before Christ. But in Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, I want you to listen to what King Nebuchadnezzar says. He says, I, the king, was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And he said, is not this the great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? See, this idea of Babel, the Tower of Babel, the city of Babylon, it carries with it this connotation of anti-God. In fact, you can read way ahead into the book of Revelation where it mentions the whore of Babylon, that great city of evil. But God's response to King Nebuchadnezzar is really telling. Listen to his response after King Nebuchadnezzar, just me, our great king. He says, even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. I gave it to you. I can take it back. You will be driven away from people, and you will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth, and he gives them to anyone he wishes. It seems that God will only allow evil to go so far. But don't mistake God's permission with God's approval. We talked about this fact on Tuesday in our men's Bible study group. One of the guys brought up the question, why does God allow evil? Why does God give Satan a certain amount of freedom to do damage? Why is there so much wrong in the world? And we talked about that and we solved it. I'm not going to tell you the answer because you weren't there. But the truth is, we don't know exactly. We don't know exactly, but we do know. And this is what we cannot forget, because when life gets tough, when curveballs are thrown at us, when things fall apart, when we're struggling in our relationships, financially, our health, we have to remember that God is sovereign. In a couple of years, we're going to have another election coming up. Everybody take a deep breath. Is he going to run? Is he not going to run? I don't know. But Christian, and I said this many, many times in the past, you are from a different kingdom. We must begin to think of the world that we live in as Babylon. We're in Babylon. What does it mean for us as followers of Christ, as followers of the one true God? What does it look like for us to be good citizens in this world, but great citizens of the kingdom of heaven? What's interesting is that the Revelation talks also about an antichrist and how he wants to unite the world under one religion, perhaps one currency, one language. See, here's the lesson for us. You've read the story of the Tower of Babel. You skim through all the names that you can't pronounce, but what is God really wanting to say to us today? And here's what I think is the lesson for us today. The sin of Nimrod, the sin of those people who built the tower, the sin of trying to make their name great is a sin that you and I struggle with as well. The first sin is this, and we all struggle with this, and I'm in the front of the line: the love of human praise and approval. The love of human praise and approval. We all crave it. Even if we try to, I don't need anybody's approval, that's proof that you probably need it and want it more than anybody else. The more you resist that idea. But be careful here. While we all want other people's approval. And by the way, here's a test. What do you do and how do you react when someone else gets credit for what you did? We all want to make a name for ourselves. Paul says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, he says, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were not still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. And so the sin that we have to watch out for, the sin that is within each one of us, it crouches. Remember, like God told Cain, it crouches, it will have you, it will own you, it will devour you, is our need for the approval of certain people in our lives. But the second sin is something that we also really struggle with, and it is the love of security. The love of security. We all crave it. We have alarms on our cars. We have locks. We have security cameras. And there's nothing wrong in and of that itself. I'm not against having security systems, but here's the real challenge. Where do I ultimately get my sense of security from? Where do I ultimately get my sense of significance? What makes me feel good about who I am? Is it the approval of other people? Is it feeling secure? Okay, I've got all my ducks lined up. I've got my 401k, and I got everything so that I have a good, safe, secure life. See, it is God's desire. And this is the bottom line. It is God's desire for us to be satisfied in and to seek only his approval and praise. And equally so, God's desire is for us to find all of our sense of security in him and in him alone. Let me read that to you one more time. You can't miss this. This is where ultimately your joy and peace in life is going to come from. God's desire is for us to be satisfied in and to seek only his approval and praise. And equally so, God's desire is for us to find all of our sense of security in him and in him alone. Now, there's more irony in this story. While Nimrod wanted the gods to come down and bless them, what he didn't know is that eventually that would be part of God's plan. God would come down, but not as a military hero, not as a political leader, but as a servant. It's an interesting contrast. If you Google the great world leaders, and you have the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Putins, you have all those great, very evil, destructive people, but you also have a guy named Jesus. And you look at how different his kingdom was compared to the kingdoms that these other great people built that have come and gone. And yet the kingdom of heaven still moves forward on this earth. And so you know the theme that I mentioned earlier, this theme of judgment and mercy. Here's the beauty of the gospel. We see that in the cross. We see ultimate judgment on sin itself. But at the very same time, in that one symbol of the cross, we see mercy. We see love. We see grace. And even as Jesus hung on that cross and took the punishment that you and I deserved, an innocent man took your punishment and my punishment, and as he hung up there on the cross, what did he say? Father, forgive them. Father, have mercy on them. Forgive them. They know not what they do. See, it's passages like this, the story of the Tower of Babel, that reminds us whatever's going on in the world, whatever's going on in your world, he's still there. He's still in control. He still has a plan. And he cares deeply. He cares deeply about the world, and he cares deeply about you. And while the cross seemed like a defeat, it was the ultimate victory, wasn't it? Because he rose from the dead. And while we cannot always understand why certain things happen in this world, and you all have been touched by the pain and the sin and the brokenness of this world. And while we don't always understand it, there will be a day when we're on the other side of eternity and we'll look back and we'll go, now it makes sense. Now I understand why. God was at work the whole time, doing what he could do, allowing us to have free will, so that he could bring about the ultimate good for you and me, but more importantly, so that he would be glorified. And your life will radically change when you stop, first of all, before you can begin, you need to stop something else. When you stop trying to make a name for yourself and you begin to make God's name great in your life. It is the difference between joy and peace, poise under pressure, confidence, contentment, all those things that you're looking for that are eluding you. Make his name great in your life, and see what he does not accomplish. Father, thank you for your word this morning. Thank you for this incredible passage that reminds us of what really matters most. And God, as we come to the table this morning, we're reminded of your judgment and of your mercy at the very same time. And we thank you, God, that because we put our trust in you, because we put our faith in you, you took the punishment and you gave us life. You gave us freedom. You gave us mercy. You gave us grace. You gave us love. And God, if there's anyone in this room who has not stepped into that, I pray today it would all make sense, that you'd open up their eyes and open up their mind to see and to understand and to comprehend that they need you. And that your death on the cross was for them. And so help them to confess. Help them to repent. Help them to believe, God. Help me to believe. And help me to walk in your truth and in your grace and in your love. In Jesus' name, amen. Whenever you're ready, you can come up and grab the elements and just take some time and think about how serious his judgment is, but how great his mercy is. In Jesus' name.